debating on it. I'm still levitated, I'm heavily medicated. Ironic, I gave him love and they end up hating on me. She told me she loved me and she been waiting. Been fighting hard for your love and I'm running thin on my patience. Needing someone to hug, even took it back to the basics. You see what you got me out here doing? Might have threw me off, but can't nobody stop the movement. Let's go. Left foot. Right foot levitating, pop stars, do a leap with the baby. I had to lace my shoes for all the blessings I was chasing. If I ever slip, I fall into a better situation. So catch up, put some cheese on it, get out and get your bread up. They always leaving you fall, but you run together. Weight of the world on my shoulders, I kept my head up. Now baby, stand up, cause girl, you want me, I want you, baby. My sugar boo, I'm levitating, the Milky Way, we're renegading. Yeah, 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 yeah. I got you, moonlight, you're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You, moonlight, you're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. You can fly away with me tonight. Baby, let me take you for a ride. Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. You can fly away with me tonight. Baby, let me take you for a ride. Yeah, 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 yeah. You can put your blast off, and I'm feeling so electric, thoughts are awesome. And even if I wanted to, I can't stop. Yeah, 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 yeah. It's like a rocket that you blast off, and I'm feeling so electric, thoughts are awesome. And even if I wanted to, I can't stop. Yeah, 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 yeah. You want me, I want you, baby. My sugar boo, I'm levitating. The Milky Way, we're renegading. I got you, moonlight, you're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. You can fly away with me tonight. Baby, let me take you for a ride. Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm levitating. You can fly away with me tonight. You can fly away with me tonight. Baby, let me take you for a ride. Yeah, 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 yeah. I got you. You're my starlight. I need you all night. Come on, dance with me. I'm levitating.
Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the TEDxRyersonU EDI TED Circle. My name is Fiza. I'm the Vice President of Events, and alongside Selena, Malika, and Marco, I will be your host for today.
Before we begin, it's important to acknowledge the land we're on. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound the shared territories and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and people, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited to the treaty in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect.
Thanks so much for that, Marco. Just a quick reminder, we are going to be recording this session and we'll be posting it on YouTube. So if you want to turn off your camera or mute yourself, please feel free to do that. And just to remind our audience, we will be announcing our giveaway winner towards the end of the event. So please stay tuned for that. And for now, Marco, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about TEDxRyersonU?
Yeah, for sure. So TEDxRyersonU is an inclusive and diverse chapter of TEDx Association, as well as the Ted Rogers Student Society, providing a platform for the industry speakers to speak upon great ideas through our live TED Talks and events we host. We are passionate about all things TED, and as the leaders of tomorrow, we are in the business of spreading great ideas every single day. Our mission is to provide Ryerson as well as TDRSM students, as well as undergraduates, with unique experiences and invaluable insights through our speeches and events. TEDxRyersonU is here to foster a professional community of ideas sharing and professional development.
Thanks, Marco. A lot of you may not be familiar with TED Circles. So what is a TED Circle? A TED Circle is a TED initiative where members come together to watch a TED Talk, and then we discuss and debate the ideas from the talk. The goal of a TED Circle is to have a dialogue from diverse points of view so that attendees and viewers can learn about different perspectives, philosophies, perceptions in a safe, open, and welcoming environment.
Tonight's event is hosted in collaboration with our amazing program development team. They are incredibly knowledgeable about tonight's theme and will be facilitating a lot of the conversation. Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about tonight's event?
Hi everyone, good evening. We're so excited to host this event with the events team, and let me start by introducing my own team. So hi, I'm Rachel. I'm the VP of Program Development, and with me I have my two directors of outreach, who are Vincent and Korji. And last but not least, we have our lovely Michelle, who is our EDI associate. So Michelle, why don't you talk about our theme for tonight?
Thanks, Rachel. The theme for today's event is EDI. The issue of diversity and inclusion is finally on the minds of leaders everywhere. As we work to create and maintain truly inclusive cultures and spaces of diverse groups, the focus has been on what we can do for others. The most important conversation has been on how we can become conscious of embracing and developing diversity within ourselves. Wendy, a coach at Shopify, offers insight on diversity from the inside out through her understanding of the delicate dance that occurs between the intellect and our emotions. Her goal is to help you embrace diversity within yourself to ultimately be inclusive of others.
That was beautifully put, Michelle. And for my favorite part now, we're going to be watching From Inside Out, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging by Wendy Knight Agard. Just a disclaimer, this TED Talk contains strong language, so viewer discretion is advised.
It's the early 1970s, a beautiful summer day in an Ottawa suburb, and I'm playing with my friends. We need to decide who's going to be it for a game of hide and seek. As we gather tight together in a circle and we each place one foot in the center, someone starts that familiar rhyme. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catcha, nigger, by the... Wait, what? I thought it was tiger. Catch a tiger by the toe. So here I am, in the middle of what's supposed to be a fun game, with this lonely sense of being in the group and at the same time not really feeling like I'm part of the group. Fast forward now several decades. I'm an adult, married with children of my own. I'm taking a course, and the facilitator's working with me to address a concern I have about caring too much about what others think of me. I'm sitting there with my eyes closed, engaged in a visualization, and suddenly it hits me. My caring too much about what others think is linked to not feeling fully included in my circle of friends when I was a kid. I realize that because I always felt slightly outside of the circle, I became hyper-aware of others' reactions to me and tried to find ways to fit in and be accepted. Fast forward again to just last year, when leaders everywhere were focused on diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I'm heads down in a diversity and inclusion project at work, and I have another realization. As we try to create these inclusive cultures comprised of diverse groups of people, the focus has been on what we can do for others. And while that's incredibly important and encouraging, there's been a glaring omission from the conversation. And that is, how do we become conscious of, embrace, and even develop diversity within ourselves? This question is essential to ask. Because if we can't accept all of ourselves, then our ability to truly embrace others is compromised. This is diversity, inclusion, and belonging from the inside out. Let's use my story as an illustration. When I realized that I cared too much about what others thought of me, I wasn't happy about it. I knew it wasn't healthy, and I really didn't like this about myself. The thing is, when we dislike something about ourselves, chances are we dislike that same trait when we see it in others. And this can lead to conscious and unconscious bias. I've worked through that issue for the most part, but imagine for a moment that I had not learned to accept that part of myself. If from that frame of mind, I was interviewing someone, and I perceived that the candidate also cared too much about what others thought, I could have allowed my bias to lead to the rejection of that candidate simply because they reminded me of a part of myself that I didn't like. And the whole thing could have happened unconsciously. This is an example of unconscious bias. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, don't we tend to hire people who are just like us? Well, we do, with an important distinction. We tend to include people who are similar to us in the ways we like about ourselves, not in the ways that we don't like about ourselves. And you can see how this presents a challenge in trying to achieve diversity and inclusion, because we all have insecurities and things that we don't like about ourselves. And these internal issues are playing out in our external interactions. Inside, out. Being open to the diversity within requires consistent and conscious effort. How many times have you heard yourself say things like, I'm not creative, or I really want that job, but I'm not good at one of the core skills required to excel in it, so I'm not even going to apply. Or I want to advance my career at work, but I'm an introvert, so I'm not comfortable highlighting my achievements to others. We tend to create these definitions of ourselves that limit our ability to grow and raise our consciousness. So what do we do about it? The first step is to become conscious of the diversity within. If we apply the metaphor of igniting a fire, think of this first step as just picking up the match. One way to become more conscious of the diversity within is to examine our emotions. Emotions are a window into the unconscious mind. And since research suggests that up to 95% of our thoughts are unconscious, the ability to connect deeply with our emotions can be a valuable tool. Are you fully aware of the full range of emotions you experience in a day or a week? Do you even allow yourself to really feel and process all of your emotions, including the ones that we tend to judge as negative, such as anger or sadness? Are you honest with yourself when you feel emotions like jealousy? What do all these questions have to do with inclusion, diversity, and belonging? Here's the connection. When we suppress certain thoughts and feelings, we are essentially not accepting the diversity of thoughts and emotions within ourselves. And this internal suppression will eventually manifest in our external interactions, just like in the example I shared earlier. Because I've done a lot of processing related to that topic, it's less likely to become a bias against other people. So the change is happening from the inside out. So the next step in our metaphor is to strike the match. It's one thing to become conscious of the diversity within, but it's a whole other thing to embrace all of it, including the parts that we don't like. But what if we could see the beauty in experiencing emotions that we tend to judge as negative, such as anger or sadness? Think of a time when you managed to fully feel and process an uncomfortable emotion and the wonderful things that happened once that processing was complete. Things that never would have happened if the feeling hadn't occurred in the first place. And what if we could learn to embrace the parts of ourselves that we don't like? If I hadn't learned to accept my tendency to care too much about what others thought, I might not be able to help others through the same challenge. So if we can learn to embrace the parts of ourselves that we don't like, then we can get a lot more out of this challenge and grow. All right, so we picked up the match by becoming conscious of diversity within, and then we struck the match by embracing what we found. Now it's time to actually ignite the fire, to develop diversity within ourselves. Sound like fun? A great way to start with this step is to learn to create a healthy separation between our sense of identity and our skills. we tend to conflate these two and define ourselves by our capabilities. But you are still you, whether you can ride a bicycle or not, right? That's easy to accept if you don't have a strong desire to ride a bicycle. But when it comes to the things that we really want, we tend to have a much more difficulty creating this separation. We also tend to have difficulty making a distinction between being our authentic selves and expanding our capabilities. For example, I've often heard people say something like, I don't want to behave like someone else to get ahead. Why can't the business environment just accept me for who I am and give me the same opportunities as everyone else? Well, that's a fair statement. Of course, we should all be accepted as we are. So when the environment around us isn't changing fast enough, it's easy to feel stuck. But what if we accepted that there are certain skills that we would benefit from developing, and just like learning to ride a bicycle, wouldn't reflect on our authenticity one way or the other? We'd be more likely to develop those skills instead of being frustrated with ourselves for not having them and angry with the environment for expecting us to. So you can see how inclusion and diversity are happening from the inside out here when we challenge ourselves to grow in ways that are uncomfortable. A simple tool for doing this is what I like to call the can't, won't, will exercise. Let's say that you're having difficulty highlighting your achievements at work, and you hear yourself say, I just can't promote myself effectively at work. If we were playing through that exercise, you would write that statement down. I can't promote myself effectively at work. Then you'd write the statement again, replacing the word can't with won't. It's just become abundantly clear that it's not something you can't do, it's something you've chosen not to do. Then you'd write the statement again, replacing the word won't with will. And this sets you on the path toward taking action. So when we get to this point, we need to think about the fact that when we challenge ourselves to grow in ways that are uncomfortable, this helps to create this diversity from the inside out. And if you do this, you've successfully stepped outside of your sense of identity to develop a skill that can benefit you. You've developed diversity within yourself by expanding your capabilities. You've practiced inclusion with yourself by giving yourself the space to do something that you had previously defined as something that wasn't you. The more you develop this ability to challenge your beliefs about yourself, the more open you can be to others and their way of being. Inside, out. I've been talking about creating these shifts from the inside, but I want to repeat, it's still incredibly important for organizations to create inclusive cultures where everyone is welcome to bring their whole selves to work. What I want to leave with you is the idea that we need to include this internal development in the conversation so that we can have better and faster results. We need to ignite a spark of this inner consciousness to accept who we are as we are, our strengths, our perceived weaknesses, imperfections, and insecurities, all while challenging ourselves to grow in ways that are uncomfortable. Revisiting that little girl in the 70s, I care much less now about what others think of me. But just as importantly, I accept and embrace the part of me that still cares at times what others think. As a result, I can have greater compassion when I see this trait in others. I know I'm okay as I am, and I want you to believe that you are too. Thank you.
I think we can honestly agree that that was a truly amazing and impactful TED Talk, my apologies. And I'm honestly looking forward to discuss the themes and getting a deeper understanding of EDI overall. But first, without further ado, it's my honor to announce that the speaker, Wendy Knight Agard, is here with us tonight. It's so nice to have you here, Wendy. Wendy is an executive coach and doctor of Heilkunst medicine who enjoys helping others develop as leaders inside and out, as well as a published author of her book, Everyday Genius, A Guide to Peaceful Leadership. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Why don't you tell us a little more about yourself?
Oh, thank you for having me. It's kind of fun to watch that TED Talk again. I haven't watched it in ages. It's like a little time warp between March of 2020 and today. I think we're all feeling that in these strange COVID times. A little bit more about me. As you said at the beginning, I am an executive coach at Shopify. I've also had my own coaching business and still do some coaching on the side. Yes, I'm an author and a speaker, and most importantly, I'm the mother of two amazing young women, and live here in Ottawa with my husband.
Thank you for giving us a quick intro, and Wendy's. It's very nice to meet you, and thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule just to come here tonight and have this EDI discussion with us. So just to start off the night, we have a few questions prepped to help launch our discussion for the night. So starting with, you mentioned how alongside realizing diversity, inclusion, and belonging from within, it is also important to, for organizations to implement such practices. With that said, we can even further that into our own communities. So I guess what I want to ask is, in your journey of developing diversity, inclusion, and belonging from within, what were some of the biggest realizations or personal lessons that you have learned?
Probably the first one was to accept that I couldn't avoid the topic. Being a member of an underrepresented group in Canada, even when I tried to ignore the topic, it would get in my face. Something would happen. I'd be at a store and someone would say something, or at work and someone would say something, or notice that I was being treated perhaps differently than other people in a group that I was in. And so I think just coming to accept the fact that this was something I was going to have to deal with, no matter, whether I wanted to or not, was really important. And then, it's about figuring out, okay, well, I'm going to have to deal with it. How? When do I say something? When do I not say something? And, I guess if I had to summarize that, I can say that the older I get, or the more experiences I have in life, the more comfortable I become in sharing my experiences and not confronting necessarily, because my approach has always been more around creating a dialogue as opposed to calling people out. But creating a space for a dialogue, I think, has probably been the biggest realization that I've had over the years. Like if somebody does or says something that I don't like, or that I feel is racist or whatever, then how am I going to deal with that in a way that's going to allow that other person to learn about their behavior, but that doesn't feel confronting to me? Sorry, I just heard the recording say stopped and started again.
Yes, I'm so sorry about that. That was a technical issue, but please go on. I apologize for that.
No worries, as long as you could all hear me. Yes, I was saying that what I came to realize is that it was really important to create a space for dialogue, so that even if I was going to talk to someone about their behavior, I was very thoughtful, and still am very thoughtful, about how to have that conversation, so that someone who may have said something that was offensive can actually learn from it, as opposed to feeling attacked.
That's so true. I know that, I know we might have different experiences, but I can totally relate to how dealing with individuals who may not even realize what they say can be offensive to you, and trying to navigate that dialogue with them. It's definitely interesting conversation, and I totally understand that it can be a difficult one. So yeah, touching base on that and how that was one of your biggest realizations. I totally agree with that. It's something I feel like we can all keep in mind with, and we can all learn how to create better conversations regarding those topics. But anywho, thank you for your answer. Moving on to another question. In your TED Talk, you mentioned the importance of developing diversity within ourselves, and this as a method of combating bias against others. So what are some common barriers that individuals may encounter on their journey to igniting their inner consciousness, and how can they overcome these obstacles?
There are so many barriers, and I think, the bottom line is it's uncomfortable, isn't it? I mean, if I had to admit tomorrow that I was jealous of somebody else, that would be uncomfortable to admit, because none of us want to admit when we're feeling jealousy, and yet probably every single one of us on this call has felt jealous of someone at some point. And so I think the biggest barrier is the discomfort. Nobody likes discomfort. We all just want to feel good all the time, don't we? And yet part of life is that we're not going to feel good all the time. The thing to remember, though, is that discomfort is your clue that you're actually on a path to learning something and growing. And you've probably all heard about growth mindset. That's a big idea in coaching. I'm a coach, so I talk about that a lot. And when you have a growth mindset, it means that you're willing to be uncomfortable. It means that you're willing to not know all the answers, that you're willing to step into difficult conversations so that you can learn and grow. A fixed mindset, on the other hand, is someone who says, hey, I have all the answers, and all I want to do is show everyone else that I have all the answers. And so I don't want to look foolish. I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to look like I don't have the politically correct terms. So I'm not even going to talk about whatever I want to talk about. Growth mindset says, I may not know the right thing to say. I may not say this perfectly, but I know I need to talk about it in order to grow. So I'm going to be vulnerable and at least attempt a conversation with someone and keep an open mind.
Thank you for your answers, Wendy. I agree that we have to embrace discomfort in order to grow as individuals. So that was really good advice from your part. I have another question for you. And in your TED Talk, you mentioned that it's equally important for organizations to foster inclusive cultures. So in your opinion, what are some ways that we as a collective can promote and foster equity, diversity, and inclusion at a macro level?
Yeah. When we talk about a macro level in organizations, what we're really talking about is the systems as opposed to the individuals, the systems, the policies, the processes and how we work, how we operate in school, things like that. And this answer might surprise you, but one of the ways that organizations can do that is to think about money. And the reason I say that is this work takes effort. It takes time. It takes hundreds of years. I mean, look, we're still talking about it. Hundreds of years after slavery ended, we are still talking about basic equity and belonging. So what that tells you is it's hard for the systems and structures to let go of their previous way of operating. And one of the ways to encourage that is for universities, companies, organizations to fund those efforts. And the reason it needs to be funded is that when we leave it up to volunteers, as we have for hundreds of years, for most of it, it's too hard for the volunteers because they've all got full-time jobs. They've got other things that they need to do, and it tends to be something that they do on the side. But if we invest in it, if organizations invest in what we're seeing now, people with full-time jobs to address diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, and all of these topics, now you have people who can actually spend all of their time every day moving the needle forward. And so when we look on that macro level, I think that funding is a huge element of that. And we need to look at that funding not as an expense, but as an investment, because there will be a return on investment. And that's an important message for businesses, because I think businesses have often looked at this as, oh, I've got to find some money in the budget for that equity and diversity and inclusion thing. Oh, where am I going to find that money? Oh, well, then maybe I can't hire someone, or I can't do some marketing. But if you can sort of change the mindset and that narrative to, instead of looking at it as an expense, it's an investment. Now a business leader can say, if I invest $100,000 in this topic, I'm going to get back $500,000 in the improved output of my company, in the improved revenue, in the improved profit. And by the way, while I don't have any of those studies top of mind to specifically quote, I have seen formal studies done by major think tanks that prove that investing in equity, inclusion, and diversity actually benefits organizations and improves their bottom line.
Great answers, Wendy. I agree that encouraging growth within systems is definitely going to be a long-term process, but it is an important investment that will ultimately benefit everyone. So now I just have a question opening up to the audience. We would love to understand what you've experienced or learned in facing various social barriers, and how did you begin to eliminate your own or others' unconscious bias? And this could be a culture embedded with internalized misogyny, homophobia, Islamophobia, or toxic masculinity. Oh, Korji, you have your hands up. Do you have something you want to share?
Oh, can you guys hear me? It's good. Okay. I think a big thing is Islamophobia, like post 9/11, the Muslim community and the Sikh community. When I'm going around, a lot of times, people are calling me names, or like, so sometimes I've been called like Osama bin Laden. I've also been attacked on my turban a few times. So there is that, in the sense that I don't like, sometimes it doesn't feel safe for like a few times, like in the sense that I belong, because a lot of times these comments are like so negative in the sense that you're not enough Canadian, you don't belong here in that sense. These are some experience, but I have learned a lot from these experience in the sense that I should speak up and talk about Islamophobia, for example, which is a big topic, and how it's also encouraging hate crime as of now.
Korjit, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. We have another person, Aditya, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Adding on to what Kawarji said, I think when you're a part of a diverse community, or in our cases, a diverse cultural group, I think the fact that when you don't fit into society, and that when you're not a part of society of how it's built in a certain place that you grew up with, I think that it's a struggle that you're kind of forced to adjust to how they have to act, whether you can't express your own personal feelings or your own cultural beliefs in that sort of essence. And adding on to what Kawarji said about being called names, about being racially profiled, I think in that sort of aspect, there's nothing you can do. And I think growth in society will only happen until the fact that society has to understand that they're not the only ones existent there, and that there's other cultural groups embedded in that. We're not so different compared to each other based on our cultural beliefs, the color of our skin, and the religious aspects that we are.
Thank you so much for sharing that, for sharing your stories, Aditya and Korji. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. Now, we want to go back to Wendy. Wendy, I still have a question for you. What are some of the immediate and long-term consequences if we do not actively address concerns regarding diversity and inclusion?
Oh, so many. Isn't life better when we have a diverse group, at a party or over a meal? Isn't life so much richer when we learn about new cultures? I mean, why do we all love to travel? It's not just because we like to lie on a beach. I mean, that's fun too, but it's also about tasting the food from a culture or a country that you haven't visited before. It's about meeting the locals. It's about learning a new way of being and a new way of operating. And, that's the spice of life. And so if we don't do this, we all miss out on learning about each other's cultures. I mean, I personally find it fascinating to learn about other cultures and try new foods, but I guess I'm willing to eat anything. So I'm kind of adventurous when it comes to foods, but it's more than food. It's about relationships and different ways of operating and different ways of parenting, different ways of worshiping. It's all so interesting. And so I think we, as humanity, we miss out on that when we just stay to our own circle of people who are exactly like us. And then to bring a practical element to it, again, to talk about business, I think it's important just because, again, big business and governments kind of hold all the money. And, business and governments are missing out again on better performance by not ensuring that they attract people from underrepresented groups and that they keep them. Because it's not just about hiring people, it's about helping them feel included and allowing them to bring their whole selves to work. So we're missing on the level of fun and relationship building and growth and learning, but we're also missing out in terms of productivity and profits if we don't do this.
That was such an insightful answer. I like that you touched both more on practicality and just the way of life. I am a strong believer that diversity is more beautiful, celebrated rather than feared. And furthermore, we would just like to ask our audiences if they have any insight on the matter. Please feel free to raise your hands, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to share, I felt like a little story just when Wendy was talking about inclusivity, about underrepresented groups. It's not personally me, but it's my mom. She's a nurse for Toronto Public Health, a supervisor overlooking a lot of the COVID operations. And one of her staff is actually deaf. And that was such a huge barrier for her because a lot of the job is contacting patients or people who are in contact with people with COVID and communicating to them their protocols, people around them, what you need to do. And this was I would say a huge obstacle for her coworker, because again, being deaf, you have to make phone calls and making open communication and all that stuff. And IT they tried to get an app on her computer, didn't work for real-time sign language, and it didn't work. And my mom's like, well, you know what, we're going to assign you to a different job, to sending emails. And after the second wave, that was around the second wave, I'm not sure what date it was. It's a long time ago. And when everything calmed down more in between the waves, my mom's like, okay, I'm gonna get this girl, this woman resources. So my mom contacted the director of public health and was like, can you get her a phone? That way you can download real-time ASL on it. That way she can communicate with patients. And my mom was just telling me, she is such a bright woman. She is so smart. However, because of barriers that she faces in the workplace and no one adapting to that, it's very hard for her to utilize her skills in the workplace. And so luckily they are able to get her a phone, and she's able to make real-time calls and have a sign language, she'll sign it to the real-time person. Of course, everything's confidential. And the person will say it to the patient, that just as a medium for communication. And one of the biggest messages was that, my mom told the woman, you can do anything you want. And even that, even it wasn't me, but her saying that just showed me that people around you do care. You just have to find those people, find those resources, and reach out to them, and they will help you get on the platform of life, basically. But yeah, I just want to share that story just to tell people, if you ever feel like you are facing barriers, there are people to help you, and do reach for those resources. And there's people going through the exact same thing. And yeah, thank you.
That's a great story. And you see, because your mom helped her, going back to the previous question, now her organization is benefiting from that person feeling like they fully belong at work. So they're going to do their best work. You said that the person was really smart. So now she can actually apply her intelligence to the job because those barriers have been taken away.
Yeah, for sure. I was really proud of my mom when she told me that. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's amazing. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's really nice. I mean, I can't really, talk about everybody here, but it's really nice to be in front of these panel members. And Wendy, it's really nice to be in front of you as well. So I come in front of you with a little bit of a personal problem, but it's also something that, another question that I have as well. So there's this really good book by Robert Greene. It's called The Laws of Human Nature. And it talks about the power of empathy, how empathy is basically the weapon that you can use to know the minds of anybody you talk to. So my question is, how do I develop utmost empathy? I mean, I've heard the perspective of Robert Greene. I just want it on your perspective, because after your TED Talk, I think, the intuitive knowledge that you have is, extraordinary. That's number one. And number two is, I mean, the personal problem that I have is that sometimes when I have, let's just say, really high self-esteem boosts, when I quote unquote become a narcissist, I completely forget about the wants and needs of other people, right? It's kind of like this pet peeve of mine. And when I, get off from that, let's just say high of narcissism and fall down to the low of, having low self-esteem, which does happen, I then tend to love and rely on people even more. So this is a toxic cycle that I have, and it's a bit of a personal problem. I just thought I'd address it here because, after your TED Talk, I think you're quite an expert. So those are my two questions. How do I develop more empathy inside me, and what's your take on empathy? And number two is, how do I get rid of my pet peeves of, going on the high and on the low, and simultaneously continuing these cycles which are not beneficial for me or anybody else?
Juicy questions. First of all, let me just congratulate you for being vulnerable and sharing them here. And we'll do our best to talk about them a little bit. So the first one about empathy, if you think about what I was saying in my TED Talk, you asked me, how can I develop empathy for someone else? And I'll just kind of pull from a line in the talk to say, by focusing on developing empathy for yourself. Okay, so that voice in your head that we all have that says things like, oh, you're so stupid, or oh, you really screwed that up. Oh man, you should have done better on that. You should have said something else. Oh, we all have that voice. We've all called ourselves names in our head. Imagine if you could start to practice whenever you hear that voice, just giving yourself some love, giving yourself a hug. You can even do that physically. You can even, go like this. Like I'm doing it right now and I already feel better. See, it made you smile. It's a simple thing. Sounds kind of silly, but it works. Hugs work, even when you give them to yourself. And so if you want to develop that for someone else, start playing with developing that for yourself. Every time you hear that voice, calling yourself a name, judging yourself, putting yourself down, just say, I'm working on it. I'm trying, right? Allow that you're not perfect, and neither am I, and neither is anyone else on this call. None of us are. We all do things that we don't like about ourselves. We all have things to work on. And believe me, it never ends. No matter how old you get, I'm a lot older probably than everyone else on this call, and I'm still working on things. It never ends. And so accepting that we're always a work in progress, there's always something more to work on, and just cutting ourselves some slack. This is what's going to allow you to have more empathy for others. It's just like I was saying in the talk, do the work from the inside, and then that will manifest outside in your interactions. Does that make sense before we move on to the second one? Yeah?
Can I just take a little time? I might have a third one as well. So
Okay. Okay. Should I get you to give yourself a hug right now?
I think I'm too self-conscious to do it here.
Okay. Okay. I'll let you off the hook and you can do it after the call. Okay. So the second one was about this cycle you were talking about of, you know, your words being narcissistic. That's probably a heavier word than you need to use, right? That's probably that inner voice judging yourself. Maybe it's more just a little bit of self-absorption or something. And then getting into the cycle when you only reach out when you're down. That's a really interesting one because I think that's common, by the way, for a lot of people. Like when things are going well, you know, our ego says, I don't need anybody. I've got it all figured out. Things are going well. I'm doing what I want to do. And then when things aren't going well, oof, I need help. I need somebody. And then we reach out. So the first thing is, again, I just want to congratulate you for noticing that that's a pattern, because many people go through their whole lives and never notice a pattern like that. So kudos to you for noticing it now. And then the thing to do is to take, you know how it feels when you connect when you're down? Like just go there in a moment. Like imagine that you're down and then you reach out to somebody on this call, like a friend or someone, and you talk to them about how you're feeling. How does that feel in that moment when you're being vulnerable with them? Like describe it.
It feels very liberating, but at the same time, I'm a bit shy as well about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels vulnerable, right? It's like you kind of bearing your soul, you know, but it also feels good, doesn't it? Right. So the thing to remember is that when you're on the high, remember how good it feels to connect when you're on the low. And then just connect when you're on the high. Because none of us wants to limit how good we're feeling. You can always take more of feeling good. So it's to remember, just to remind yourself that when you're feeling great and everything's going well, why not add to it by connecting to someone? And then there's another angle there. When you're connecting to someone when you're feeling good, often you can help them feel better. Like they might not be on a high. And doesn't it feel good when you're helping someone else? I mean, that's why I love coaching. It feels good. I have a selfish reason for loving coaching. Yes, I'm helping others, but guess what? It feels good when I help others. So if you think about it that way, when things are going well for you and you're on a high, go and help someone, because that's when you have the energy to help someone. That's when you have the energy to give, and you'll only feel better. Yeah, somebody put in the chat, radiating the positive energy. Yeah, I like that. So does that make sense? It's something you could try?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And, you know, it actually proves to me that you probably have the expertise to answer my third question as well.
Oh, so, there's a setup. I better answer it now.
Okay. So the third question is, well, it's kind of like a long question, but I'll try to keep it as short as I can. So there's this German philosopher, his name is Immanuel Kant, and he came up with the principle of humanity, you know, if you're familiar with that. So the principle of humanity usually suggests that, you know, treat your neighbor like, you know, as an end, but and not as a means, right? So when you're doing something for somebody, or, you know, when you're just casually being yourself around people, it has to be a moment where that is the end, like that activity is the end, and it's not the means to something. Like suppose today I ask you out for lunch. I go out to lunch with you. You have a good social media following, and then I take a picture with you. I post you, and now I have a better social media following that I had before, right? So going out to lunch with you is the means to the end, which is getting a better social media following. So instead, in another universe, I go out to lunch with you, and I just go out to lunch because I want to go out to lunch and have a meaningful experience with you, you know, via our conversations.
Yeah.
So my question is, in this, you know, you're a very realistic woman. I have to put it out there and then ask this question. In the real world, everything is, you know, things we mostly do are the means to something, right?
Yeah.
So how do I process, things to be an end and actually live in the present while I'm doing it? Because that is kind of like, the cycle of how that goes. If you consider something an end, you ought to be present. And if you are present, whatever you're doing is the end. So, if you could just answer that question for me, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, that's you've been doing some deep thinking there. That's a deep question. Yeah, there's so many ways to look at that. I mean, one is to start with the word authenticity. So yes, you might invite someone to lunch and you might know that they have a social media following that could help you out. And you can still be authentic in your interactions with that individual in the moment when you are with that individual. So sometimes the brain tends to think of things in polarities, like I'm either present and authentic, or I'm working on getting to the end. And perhaps the best way to address this in a way that you can practice it is to think about dissolving those polarities and to think, how can I do both? Because sometimes you do have practical goals to achieve in the material world. We live in the material world. Maybe you need to get a job. So there's an end there. You may be interviewing and you want to be authentic and honest in the interview, but you also want to impress those interviewers because you need a job so that you can eat. And so one of the things, as I said, that the mind does is it says, well, if I'm authentic, I might not get the job. If I go to get the job, then I might not be authentic. You can do both. You can have a goal for the meeting and still be authentic in the meeting. But when I say that, how does that land for you?
I feel like in my language, that translates to, there's always a diplomatic approach to however you, interact with people. And diplomatic in a very positive sense. It's the acknowledgement of the environment, and at the same time, not being somebody who you're not, because ultimately it's not that, the person who's interviewing you was born yesterday. So, I understand your point completely. And, the thing that I love about this conversation is that you're very realistic. And I have a very soft corner for realistic people.
Thank you. And thanks for asking your questions. Great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abar, for your questions. And thank you for everyone for sharing your inputs and insights into this discussion. It was very engaging. And I wish we had more time to, keep on going and, have a longer conversation on this. But since it is already 6:55, I'm just going to be moving forward with the discussion, if that's all right. So thank you again all for sharing your inputs. But moving on, Wendy, seeing that EDI is a growing topic of discussion, there may be parts where people have misconceptions still or disagreements on the matter. What are some common myths or misunderstandings that people may have about EDI that you would like to challenge?
Well, one is that it's not worth doing. Nobody wants to admit that they think that, but a lot of people think that it's not worth doing. And so we need to remind people, again, what I was saying earlier about the investment paying off, that there is real value on the other side of it. Another one is that, often the people who think they don't need EDI training or to acquire any new knowledge are the ones who need it most. So I think it's really important, and that's not a judgment, by the way. It's just an acknowledgement of unconscious bias. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that every single one of us, even everyone on this call who is a human being, has unconscious bias. The brain will create bias as a way of creating shortcuts. It's just what the brain does. It sees something a few times, and there may be 6 steps in the thing that it's observing. And after the 6th time, the brain will say, oh, I'm going to skip the steps 2 to 5 and go from 1 to 6. That's how stereotypes get formed, right? We see someone who looks a certain way or from a certain country or whatever doing something. And then we maybe see that 5 or 6 times, and then we assume everyone who looks like them or is from the same country is going to do the same thing in the same situation. The brain loves to make shortcuts. So I think it's really important to just acknowledge that we all have unconscious bias and to start from there. And if we're honest with ourselves about that, that's how we can start to become more aware of our unconscious bias. Did that make sense?
Yes, yes, it did. Thank you so much for your answer. And just another question to ask. We just have a question in the audience or in the chat box. So sorry if I mispronounced your name, but Bersabel asked, "Hi, Wendy, do you have any book or podcast recommendations to further improve our knowledge on EDI?"
Oh, goodness. Any book or podcast? I haven't listened to podcasts in ages. There's a book called White Fragility that I confess I have not read, but I've heard very good things about it. I've also heard of another one that I have not read, but have heard very good things about it, and that's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so those are 2 good ones that I've heard many allies that I work with have read and say that it was really helpful to them.
Thanks so much for that, Wendy. Marco, you have your hand raised. Do you want to contribute to the discussion?
Yeah, the original question was in reference to what are some common myths or like misunderstandings in terms of EDI and that kind of stuff. Excuse me. You mentioned actually in your TED Talk the concept of creating a space for a dialogue instead of calling people out. And I think that there is a very large misunderstanding in terms of at least people I talk to or people I've seen when it comes to EDI, and particularly, for example, like, you know, the patriarchy or masculinity, in the sense where they are afraid to speak about the topic at all, simply because they're afraid of the response they're going to get because of how, for example, the media portrays cancel culture or how people portray people who have outdated views. And you mentioned throughout this conversation the concept of educating people instead of calling them out. And I would love to hear your opinion on the myth of, or the misunderstanding where people don't want to lash out on you for your mistakes, but rather, you know, not call you out, but correct you and make you a better person. Because at the end of the day, we need to correct ourselves and move forward as a humanity and make sure we can all be better people in the end, so we can be a better group, right? I'd love to hear your opinion on the concept of educating people rather than calling people out.
Yeah. Let's face it, if it's happening to you, it requires a fair bit of energy, right? Because the natural reaction is to usually get angry based on the hurt. You know, if somebody slights us, it's hurtful. And so we tend to either withdraw or get angry. And so the challenge then is to sit with that feeling a little bit and say, okay, how can I turn this situation into something that could actually help me connect more with this person who just said that thing to me? And, you know, just doing something as simple as not responding right away, like take 2 or 3 seconds to take a deep breath and stay calm and ask yourself how you actually want to respond. And some days you might say, I'm not even going to respond. You know, if I'm in the line at the grocery store and someone starts touching my hair, sometimes I'm just in a rush and I'm not interested in engaging with that person. I'm going to pretty much ignore them and leave. On another day, I might have energy to turn around and have a conversation with them, you know, and ask some questions. You know, what is it that makes you want to touch my hair? You know, they may ask me some questions about my hair, and then I can educate them. You know, I get questions about my hair all the time. And so I can answer those questions in a way that is matter of fact and non-judgmental, or I can decide not to. I really want to be careful to leave with you the idea that if you are in an underrepresented group or someone has committed a microaggression or said something overtly racist to you or whatever, you don't have the obligation to educate them. So that's important, right? It's not an obligation, it's a choice. And so what I submit to you is you do have the power to make that choice. And then you can take that time to sit with it and respond in a way that you know will be constructive, as opposed to reacting in a way that they'll just walk away and say, oh, well, that person was an awful person to me, because that doesn't further the dialogue. And that's really the challenge. It's sitting in the discomfort of the emotion, in the hurt or the anger or whatever it is, and then deciding to respond from a calmer place.
Thank you. Honestly, that's an amazing response, and I'm going to take that and use that in my everyday life. One issue that I constantly have to deal with is, like I said before, toxic masculinity, in the sense where I've never been the most masculine person. Sports have never been my thing. I've never followed traditional gender roles in those senses, right? And every day I have to deal with that, if that's from people outside, that's from the internet and that kind of stuff. And I think the one thing that really resonated with me was that you don't have the obligation to educate. And I think that really stuck with me, because I felt for a long time that if I don't say anything, am I part of the problem? If I don't educate these people, am I just as bad as lashing out, or am I just as bad as not saying anything? So I really do resonate with what you said. So thank you so much for your response.
Yeah, I mean, and there may be people on this call that disagree with me on that and think that it is an obligation. It's just my opinion. And I think that if you're doing it out of obligation, it's going to be hard for you to respond in a way that's conciliatory. And so you just got to be honest with yourself and say, not today. Sometimes it happens and you just don't have the energy to deal with it, and that's okay.
Thank you so much, Wendy.
You're welcome.
Selena, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add on to that and, share my bit of experience on that topic. I come from a country that's perhaps not very well recognized. And when I did move to Canada, for me, I sensed a lot of perhaps ignorance towards that part of the world. And it really resonates with me when you mentioned that the obligation to be able to, educate them and to perhaps some days take the back seat and, be like, today is not the day. And this is something that I used a lot in my daily life, because I faced it on perhaps a daily basis, because perhaps I didn't look very Canadian or anything like that. And it's so important to recognize that it's not always your obligation to teach people things that might be very common or might not be common, right? It's not, I'm not going to say it's not your place, but sometimes it can be very, very exhausting to even do that. So, as a person who came to this country, and I certainly saw a lot of, I was in a cultural shock when I did come. And just to really, really emphasize on that point, because I know going through it, on a daily basis, it can definitely be very exhausting. And the obligation is that is such an important part. And I'm so glad you mentioned it, Wendy. I think it was awesome. That answer was so good.
Oh, I'm glad it helped.
We have another person who's raised their hand. Isabella, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi. First of all, I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Shalina. I completely agree with you and what Wendy you said as well. My question kind of is, what if you are feeling that you should be educating someone, but how do you transfer? Because at times I feel like I use my emotions too much when I'm trying to educate people. So I feel like it's rooted with anger more emotion. I take it very personally. So I want to know how to be able to transfer that energy, rather coming to a calmer state, which I've been trying to do, but I think it's sometimes hard when it's you directly experiencing it.
Yeah, I know it can be hard. And that's why I say it can be really helpful to just take a couple of seconds. Like when you feel angry, do you feel it in your body in a certain place?
No.
So you don't get a physical signal? Okay.
No.
You said very clearly that you feel angry, right?
Yeah, it's more of a angry of like believing that someone can think that way, but then you kind of have to like step back and understand why. I know I understand the process, but it is difficult sometimes to remove your emotion when you're trying to have a conversation, when you're trying to educate and just have a conversation rather than an argument.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, let's use a scenario. Let's say that you were, let's use the interview example again. Let's say you were in an interview for a job. You're going for a job, and the interviewer says something that is a microaggression, and you feel angry. How would you handle it in that instant?
Before I would answer in a very like personal matter, but I think I've learned to take a moment to, as you said, take a pause, but it's still kind of difficult. But I think I would try to attempt to ask or think in my head, like, how did they get that perception? Or like, what made them, I don't know, this is kind of personal for me, but I grew up in a very predominantly white town. So I experienced a lot of microaggressions, but not in defense, but I understood because they never knew otherwise, some weren't as educated. So I think having that step back or information, you're able to like make that, you're able to think of how they would think of that response. Like, as you said, having patience and having empathy of like why they would think that way, but you also need to, you don't need to, as you said, educate, but yeah, I don't know, it's a long answer.
Yeah, but you see how you just answered your own question? Right? So that's why I use the example of an interview. I was trying to think of an example of when you might not feel comfortable just letting all your anger out, right? And so you do have those tools where even when you're angry, you can take a few deep breaths or take a step back. And you even said just now that you can even have some understanding for them, maybe not having been exposed to people different than they are because they're from a small town in the example that you used. So that's really all you need to do. You're already doing it. Just practice doing it perhaps a little more fully, or maybe stepping into the conversation a little more fully after the initial reaction as a way of creating that dialogue that we were talking about. And again, only when you want to.
Yes,
You don't have to do that every time.
I think a lot of people can relate that they feel so obligated when there's so many materials and resources. Like, you can literally, there's so much that they can look for. So it's not your obligation to teach them.
Not at all. Not at all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Isabella, for your input. And thank you, Wendy, for sharing your insight as well. Just to bring up, I know that in the chat, Sabrine has asked a question. She says, studies after studies have shown that the fact to be aware of our own unconscious biases doesn't stop people to discriminate, and in brackets, act on your own prejudices. So Sabrine was asking, what is your view on how to change behaviors in a deeper level?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about whether, learning about your unconscious bias helps or doesn't. And I've heard both sides of it. If I share a personal story, it worked for me. I used to have an unconscious bias about women with very high voices. I don't know why. I can't tell you where it came from. All I know is at some point around 20 years ago, I started to notice it. Like, if I met someone with a very high voice, I would kind of dismiss them. I don't know if there was someone in my childhood who had a similar voice that I didn't respect. I honestly don't know where it came from. What I can tell you, though, is once I became aware of that, the bias disappeared. Because now, if I meet a woman or anyone with a very high voice, I'm constantly checking myself. Listen with an open heart, Wendy. I have a self-talk that says, listen with an open heart, give this person the same respect you would give anyone else. And so now it's not even an issue. Now, it's true that, sometimes learning about unconscious bias can just get you more focused on the bias. I don't know if that's what some of these studies have said, but I think that might be some of the reasoning behind that. Well, hey, if you point out all your unconscious bias, then now you're just seeing all your bias everywhere. Right? So to answer your question about changing behaviors on a deeper level, that's a tough one to answer because that's going to be different for everyone, right? My deep issues may be different from all the faces I'm seeing on the screen right now. So it's hard to answer in a general sense. If I was coaching someone one-to-one, then I could get into that because I could be questioning that person around where their beliefs come from, helping them to understand their beliefs, their values, their judgments. And then we would work together to unpack those beliefs and values and judgments and help them to see things in a new light. And so if you want to get to that deeper level, then it may require some coaching, frankly, or, you know, a deep conversation with someone so that you can start to unpack where it's coming from. I'm not sure if that's helpful because it's not a one size fits all answer.
Sure. We have another question in the chat, Wendy, and it says that what is a good time for kids to, what is a good age for kids to learn about EDI? This is from Ali. If you want to answer that.
Yeah, well, this is probably not a very popular answer for some of your parents, but I'd say as soon as possible. And if my girls were listening to this recording, they would laugh because I was the kind of parent who often talked to my kids about adult type themes. I think children are incredibly intelligent. I think they know as much as we do. In many ways, they know more because their ego hasn't gotten in the way of their thinking and their feeling and their ability to see the world for what it is. And so I think it's just a judgment call on the part of the parent to look at their child and assess what their child is ready to hear. And I mean, you don't have to deliver the message the same way to a 6-year-old as you would to a 12-year-old, right? To a 6-year-old, it might be it might be reading a book. You know, I remember seeing this little book, I can't remember what it was called, but it had these sort of gingerbread people in it, and they were all different colors. You know, one was green, one was purple, they were all these different colors. And it was a great little story about diversity and inclusion that a 6-year-old could enjoy. And I read it to my girls when they were little, but a 12-year-old isn't going to engage with that little storybook. It's going to be more of a conversation about, you know, how they want to interact with people in their class or on their sports team or in their church group, you know, wherever they hang out with friends. It's going to be a more practical conversation about how they're treating their friends, how their friends are treating them. But yeah, I just think that you can start pretty much as young as you think your kids can handle it, and as soon as they're asking questions.
That makes perfect sense to me. I completely agree. Abar, you have your hand raised as well. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Fiza, is it?
It's Fiza, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Fiza. So Wendy, I'm back again, and I have kind of a deep question again as well. So there are two sides of a spectrum when it comes to dealing with conflict, which are altruism and aggressiveness. And my mother is a very altruistic person. She's a, you know, peacekeeper, and my father is not, you know, he's kind of like on the aggressive side. But at the same time, the irony of the situation is that whenever I used to talk about my childhood conflicts with my dad, he always gave me the advice that you should always maintain the peace and always, you know, ignore, you know, whoever's trying to fight you, and, you know, just walk your path. And whenever I went to my mom, who actually is, you know, by heart the peacekeeper, she always advised the opposite. Like, you know, you should probably, if someone punches you once, you punch them thrice, and make sure that the third one, you know, ensures that they fall on the ground and don't get up. Right. So, you know, what I want to talk to you about is that I've dealt with a lot of issues when it comes to, you know, fights. Basically, I'm a very disagreeable person. And because of that, you know, conflicts just keep coming at me. And I try to make the best out of the situation by, you know, maintaining the peace and trying to get things in control in non-lethal ways. But at the same time, there have been times in my past where, I've had to use, impeccable action for events that were not really all that important. So there is this thing about, people coming back again and again to actually aggravate you if you don't hit them back, right? Or if you don't take an aggressive step. And there are situations where you can be the bigger person and take an altruistic approach. So I'm still in the confusion on where I should be aggressive and where I should be altruistic, because truth be told, I'm a big fan of war, right? I'm a big fan of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? He's a French revolutionary. And I'm also a big fan of Gandhi and, Buddha, right? So I have these, inner conflicts with myself on whether I should take, the bigger approach or the bigger approach. You know what I mean? So I really need you to give me some insight on what I should do. Honestly, I'm kind of suffering here.
Okay, I'll do my best in this format. But the word that was coming to mind as I was listening to you was one I mentioned earlier, and it's this idea of polarities. When you described your mom and your dad, each of them kind of sit on two opposite ends of the spectrum, and then they deal with it by doing what? Reaching out to the opposite side of the spectrum. Isn't that interesting? But what does that tell you? It tells you that you want to catch yourself when you're looking at things in this with a polarity mindset. Do I fight back or do I be altruistic? Because the answer is usually very gray and somewhere in between. It's not clearly black or white. It's somewhere in here. And I know that's not the answer you want to hear because you want a concrete answer. But the reality is the world is very gray. Things are not always simple and black and white. And so that's where discernment comes in. That's where stepping back and deciding, okay, what is the most effective solution in this particular situation, and choosing that one. And remember that the most effective choice you're going to make in any given situation also depends on the other person. Because sometimes this situation is more about their work than yours. So there's a lot of nuance and a lot of discernment that you have to bring to those. And so it's hard for me to give you an exact formula to use in a situation like that, other than to say, beware of polarity thinking and recognize that you can choose different reactions in different situations. And remember that the other person has their own stuff and you have your stuff, and you can only control yours.
That makes complete sense.
Okay.
And I don't really want to outshine the master, right? But if I could just add on to somebody asked the question about reacting emotionally to situations. If I could just give my 2 cents, would that be a problem?
Abrar, I'm so sorry to have to say no. We are 5 minutes over the time.
Oh, that's completely
So
fine.
sorry about that. I would love to continue this conversation for another hour, honestly. But we have to be mindful of other people's time. So Marco, do you want to do the honors?
Yes, once again, this was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot. I hope everyone who attended learned a lot. I want to first thank Wendy for coming. I know you're very, very busy, so thank you so much for attending. And that concludes our TED Circle today. Thank you guys all for coming, but it is finally time to announce our giveaway winner. Our $25 Tim Hortons gift card winner is going to go to Loretta Rumberg. So congratulations.
Congratulations, Loretta. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Wendy. I'm so sorry we went a little over time, but this conversation was just so engaging. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And thanks so much for program development. You guys facilitated such an interesting conversation. And thank you so much for attendees for being super engaged as usual. We hope you enjoyed our event today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks so much. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Bye.